Thank you so much for having me. Really, it's wonderful to be back. And in many ways, this has been a journey. I started with physical exam, and I ended up with two brains. So let me tell you a little bit about this. It's a talk I'll be giving at ACP National next year. And I actually gave it to the medical students at AMSA in Washington, their national meeting. So let's more talk about two physicians, actually, since that's what the talk is about. And we'll start with the first one. And you might have seen this painting. If you went to the Tate Gallery in London, it's there. I actually stumbled upon it. I did not know it was there, and I spent a good half an hour watching it. Now, it's called The Doctor. And Sir Luke Fielders had portrayed a physician taking care of a little baby, more than a baby, a little child, because he had lost his 2-year-old on Christmas Eve to scarlet fever. And he was so touched by this physician, whose name was Murray, who spent the night with the child, even though he could offer very little. And so our eye is drawn to this man. We know he's a physician, even though he's missing all the implements that, according to the public, make us physicians. If you survey the public, they say a stethoscope, a white coat, and a reflective mirror. And then, of course, they add the black box, the black bag. He has none of that. In fact, he doesn't even have a white coat. They hadn't been invented yet for physicians. But he has the gravitas of the physician, and he's giving time. The father is in the back, and he's in awe, and the mother is crying. The night has to pass. You get the sense that the kid will make it. He receives some concoction, but basically he's getting time. And the BMJ got so touched that in 1887, just 5 years later, they wrote an editorial. What do we not owe to Mr. Fielders for showing the world a typical doctor as we would like to be shown? An honest man and a gentleman doing his best to relieve suffering. A library of books in our honor will not do what this picture has done and will do for the medical profession in making the hearts of our fellow men warm to ours with confidence and affection. Okay, so that's 100 years ago. Go forward 100 years and you get him. All right, so let's see the other doctor.
The question is, do I have a God complex?
Dr. Kessler says yes.
Which makes me wonder if this lawyer has any idea as to the kind of grades one has to receive in college to be accepted at a top medical school. If you have the vaguest clue as to how talented someone has to be to lead a surgical team. I have an MD from Harvard. I am board certified in cardiothoracic medicine and trauma surgery. I have been awarded citations from 7 different medical boards in New England, and I am never, ever sick at sea. So I ask you, when someone goes into that chapel and they fall on their knees and they pray to God that their wife doesn't miscarry, or that their daughter doesn't bleed to death, or that their mother doesn't suffer acute neural trauma from post-operative shock, who do you think they're praying to? Now, you go ahead and read your Bible, Dennis, and you go to your church, and with any luck you might win the annual raffle, but if you're looking for God, he was in operating room number 2 on November 17th, and he doesn't like to be second-guessed. You ask me if I have a God complex? Let me tell you something. I am God.
Okay. All right, so how do we go from him to him? All right, and that is, in a sense, the tale of the two physicians, and it's the tale of the two brains. Now, a fascinating paper has reviewed how Hollywood portrays us. We are, by the way, among the most portrayed profession in movies, and has been downhill since the 50s ever since, okay? Now, what is reason is the physician as some sort of a jerk with potential. So in the sense that, they get sick and then they see the light. And this is actually something based on an autobiography, and it was a powerful movie. We use it on Movie Club at Jefferson to try to teach kids a little bit about that. Great movie to see. So we have become painfully aware of that, and a lot of people have written about it. From Bernie Lown from nearby Boston, who has written about the lost art of healing, And of course, Louis Thomas wrote about the fact that we need to put back the humanities. The humanities were what was missing in medicine. And then people have complained about the rise of technology as a way to separate us from patients. But if we look at all the good things whose absence we lament in medicine, let's review them. Empathy. Jefferson has a scale. Empathy drops like a rock during third year of medical school and during internship. Intuition. Humor. That's definitely a problem in medicine. The bedside, that's how I got to this thing, because of course the bedside is struggling with relying on labs and scans. The humanities of Louis Thomas, of course, and Sherwin Nuland. And more has been written about tolerance of ambiguity. This month, actually, there was an editorial this past month in Academic Medicine saying that we attract students that have low tolerance and we make them even more intolerant. And her point, this was Gil Geller from Hopkins, is we should not bring kids into medical school that have intolerance for ambiguity. But all of this, and the capacity to see the world in color, the capacity to see the forest rather than the trees, are all expression of the right brain mode of engagement, what gave the Nobel Prize to Sperry for his studies on lateralization. So let me tell you a little bit about this tale of two brains. Now, again, it's not right and left because, of course, neurologically, we know that these are more metaphors for two ways of engaging the world. And it's not location. It's really two separate ways, a very narrow, very focused, very close-up way, which is the left way, and a wide-angle approach. So let's review the differences. The left is linear, the right is intuitive. The left is analytic, the right is synthetic. The left is symbolic, the right is actual, real. The left is sequential, the right is simultaneous. The left is a splitter, the right usually is holistic. The left controls feelings, sees you as another. The right sees you in a compassionate fashion, as part of the whole. The left is clearly intolerant of ambiguity. The right is compassionate and tolerant. The left sees the trees, the right sees the forest. The left expresses itself through language, speech, writing. The right is music, imagery, poetry, drama, math, is nonverbal communication. The left is literal, the right is imaginative. The left is verbal, the right is nonverbal. The left has no sense of humor. If you stroke your right hemisphere, you're not going to get puns, metaphors, and paradoxes. No sense of humor for jokes. That's all right-sided stuff. The left is rational and logical. The right is creative, non-rational. The left is very rigid, very structured. The right is flexible. The left sees the world in black and white. The right sees it in colors. The left has knowledge. The right has wisdom. The left is lab-oriented. The right is bedside-oriented. The left is scientific. The right is artistic. The left is digital. The right is spatial, visual. The left is a splitter. The right is a lumper. The left is authoritarian, the right is collaborative. And we could actually say that the left is the Germany of the brain and the right is the Italy of the brain. So we say that a lot when we say, you know, I got to make this decision. My gut tells me to do that. Sometimes we say my heart tells me to do that. My brain tells me to do something else. That's what you're talking about, okay? Now, Rita Levi-Montalcini, who passed away last year at the age of 103, still sharp as a tack. She is one of 10 women who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine, and she won it for nerve growth factors. She was herself an artist. She illustrated most of her papers, and her twin sister was a very well-respected artist. Their mother was a painter, and the brother was an architect. She knew that you need both brains in order to be very creative. Everybody says that the brain, the left side, is the most complex organ of our body. As a physician, I could agree, but as a woman, I can assure you that there is nothing more complex than the heart and the right brain. Even today, we don't fully understand its workings. There is logic in reason, but there are emotions in the reasonings of the heart. So we need to strive to be a symphony of hemispheres. The problem is that as a society, we bash the right brain mode of engagement. And in medicine, we do the same. Now, the problem with this approach is that it has become so much new age, even though there is a huge body of scientific literature behind it, that when Mercedes-Benz uses it to sell cars, you can understand why people's eyes roll back when you start talking about the left and the right brain. But there is indeed a separation. Now, people have been using codes. They've been talking about what have you done creatively lately. This is actually November Academic Medicine. We're talking about empathy. We're talking about tolerance for ambiguity. But again, those all are traits of the right brain mode of engagement. So let's go back to where it began, to Greeks. That's how we got our craft. For the Greeks, there was no split into cultures. They used the very same word, techne, for art and science. They made no separation. And in medicine, you had to use music, drama, poetry in order to heal. Now, a quintessential humanist who was both an artist and a scientist was Leonardo. Leonardo would have laughed at the idea of the two cultures. The CPs know intuition that we were splitting these two modes of engagement. And it's getting worse. The state of Florida is now passing legislation that will charge you more tuition if you take the humanities as a major than the sciences. Now, I wrote an editorial in the Cleveland Clinic on it. This was an editorial from Yale. This is actually the one who runs the Yale residency program about the need to put back the humanities. But the humanities are a spin-off of the right brain. So let's talk about the right brain. After a certain high level of technical skills is achieved, science and art coalesce in aesthetics, plasticity, and form. The greatest scientists are always artists. And Rita agreed, scientific creativity is no different from artistic creativity. And of course, all children are artists. Still, at the age of 6, they get into school. And schooling kills their right brain approach. Everywhere I go, said Sigmund Freud, I find a poet has been there before. And you can be artistic, whatever you do. I remember a Napolitan street sweeper that told me, I do my job artistically. And I take pride in the fact that you can do that at any level, even as a teacher. Steinbeck wrote, I've come to believe that a great teacher is a great artist. And there are as few as there are any other great artists. Teaching may be the greatest of all arts, since the medium is the human mind and the spirit. Unfortunately, as Jerry Levy put it, and she was an assistant to Sperry, American education up through graduate school is designed to ablate the student's right hemisphere. And it's not American education, it's education. All right, so if art is the thesis and science is the antithesis, we need a Da Vinci, or we need Nether. Remember Nether? I studied on his books. This man had to go to medical school because his mother made him. He wanted to become an artist. But during medical school, he took notes by drawing and sketching stuff. And his fellow classmates were so taken by his ability to capture information that eventually he made a little bit of money selling those. And eventually Ciba-Geigy bought them all, and he made a career by becoming Nether. And I studied on those books. They were very expensive when I was in medical school because they were amazing. As DeBakey put it, Dr. Nether's contribution to the study of human anatomy is epochal. He has advanced our understanding more than any other medical illustrator since the time of Vesalius, the power of imagery versus the poverty of word. All right, so very briefly, a ridiculous short story of history of medicine. How did we go from him to him? Well, medicine, the way we know it, started through the ashes of the revolution, because the physicians that were there were mostly court physicians, physicians of aristocrats. They all lost their job, if not their head. So what came out of that massacre was a new genre of physicians, who were mostly surgeons, because they were the only left around. And these were guys that could do stuff. They could patch up soldiers, put them back on the battlefield. Larrey invented the ambulance. He was the personal physician to Napoleon. These guys created the new schools to crank out the new physicians that could bring universal health care, which was, of course, one of the dreams of the new republic. Their motto was, see little, but read a lot. Sorry, read little, but see a lot, and do even more. This was very practical. This is how Laennec came of age, and this is how Osler came of age. So, the model from which modern medicine was born was the Franco-British model, the French model. And these guys were French, so they were touchy-feely, aesthetic folks, oriented at the bedside, and in many ways, he was the epitome of this humanistic physician. As you know, he gave us the book, but he gave us a model, the model of the clinician as a compassionate human being. And he said, I desire no other epitaph than the statement I taught med students on the wards. And I regard this by far as the most useful, important work I've ever done. Okay, so Franco-British model lasts till 1870. And then, as always, the shift in culture follows a shift in military power, which basically means there's a big war between the French and the Prussians. It's the 1871 war. The Prussians win a huge victory. They take Paris, they proclaim the Reich, and everything shifts from Paris to Berlin. Never as touchy-feely as the French, the Germans bring to medicine the science, because they produce giants like Koch, Virchow, Röntgen. And these guys gave us something that we were missing. And at that point, America found itself at a crossroads. Should have she gone the French way or the German way? And what it did, of course, thanks to Flexner, who was the son of German immigrants, went the German way. We brought in the sciences. Now, Flexner had no desire to abolish the humanities. He was himself a product of the humanities. He just wanted more sciences. By the way, do you see anything interesting about these pictures? All of them are looking towards the right side, which means the dominating hemisphere is the left hemisphere. When you think and you scan with your eyes because you're thinking, if you deviate your eyes towards the right, you're using your left hemisphere. There's a paper on it. Take a look at William Osler. All right, so can we separate right-brainers from left-brainers? Take a look at this ballerina. Tell me which way she's spinning. Who sees her spin clockwise? Raise your hands. Who sees her spinning counterclockwise? Raise your hand. Who sees her go back and forth between the two modes? Okay, so this made the rounds of the internet, and the idea was that if you see her spin clockwise, your right brain, if you see her spin counterclockwise, your left brain, and if you see her going back and forth, you are a symphony of hemispheres. It's an illusion. Take a look how it is an illusion. See now? See now? It's an illusion. It's an illusion. All right, so hasn't been validated. The point is that there is no good way to separate the right from the left. Okay? And most of the times we engage both modalities. If you want to read the book on this thing, it's a Yale published tome of 500 pages by Ian McGilchrist, who taught literature at Oxford for many years and then became a neuropsychiatrist. He did training at Hopkins, and he wrote the first half on all the information. It's 2,000 articles quoted on why there is indeed a separation right to left, and the second half is how the West, from the Enlightenment on, has bashed the right brain. Okay? And what is fascinating is that if something bad happens, like you have a stroke, all of a sudden traits that you never knew you had come out. For example, you can start painting. And there's quite a bit on that in the literature. The most interesting aspect was actually the story of Jill Bolte-Taylor, a Harvard neurophysiologist who stroked her left brain, and all of a sudden she achieved nirvana. She achieved oneness with the universe and spoke very eloquently about her experience in this book, which is about to be turned into a movie. And if you have 15 minutes, do a TED video search for My Stroke of Insight, and you'll see her conference. It's 15 minutes, and we'll tell you exactly what it means to go from being a left brain neurophysiologist to a right brain person. Now, when you go to Tulane, they make this book mandatory reading. And of course, Tulane is Tulane, which means New Orleans, the right brain capital of America. They have a society at Tulane Medical School called SARBA, Students Against Right Brain Atrophy. So William Osler is, again, the epitome of this approach. And Osler, in 1905, when America goes the German way, he goes to England to remain the Franco-British way. And he writes, when he's graduate professor of medicine at Oxford, just before dying, humanities and science, right and left brain, are twin berries on one stem. Grievous damage has been done to both, regarding them in any other light than complemental. We need them both. Okay? Now, so what happened? Take a look at the Gross Clinic. You might have seen this portrait of Dr. Gross. Ickes is in the back. He's the author. This was made in Philadelphia at Jefferson Medical College, donated by the alumni to Jefferson Medical College, sold by our beloved president a few years ago to Walmart. The city of Philadelphia erupted into outrage and they bought it out, but that's what the guy did. Notice that he doesn't have a white coat. Now, a few years later, after the Prussian victory in the Franco-German War, now we got a white coat. And notice how the distance between the patient has increased. And of course, a Y code becomes the way to go. In 1911, everybody has it. We've gone from the healer to what Oxford Regius professor calls now the uncaring technocrat. That this was an editorial in the BMJ. All right, so the left brain has served us very well. We have decoded the genome. But at the same time, the public seems to realize that something is missing, particularly Maureen Dowd. Every editorial that she writes on physicians is not particularly positive. As I told you, Hollywood doesn't portray us as good guys, and we ourselves burn out. This is actually an editorial, is a research done and published last year in the archives. 1 out of 2 of us by age 50 has burned out. So, I told you about tolerance for ambiguity. This is the academic medicine paper from last month, and she is again suggesting that we should bring in kids with a more holistic approach. The New England Journal had a paper on that recently. Here's what she writes. In medical practice, low tolerance for ambiguity has been associated with a biomedical rather than a biopsychosocial worldview. That to me is code for left brain versus right brain. Okay, and it's true. If you are intolerant, you have the left brain approach. And then she goes out on a limb. Sociologists of medicine have long observed that the medical education process rewards certainty. We make them even more intolerant. In recognition that ambiguity and uncertainty have been neglected in the culture of medicine, this is the right brain. There have been recent proposals to acknowledge, embrace, and explicitly cultivate, and then she says, we should screen. And if they don't have tolerance, we should not let them in, because she's convinced it gets even worse. All right, so if we need a symphony of hemispheres, how can we rekindle the right brain? Well, we need to start learning the languages of the right brain. In fact, relearning the languages, which of course are imagery and music, but also drama, which means poetry and acting, theater, and math. A lot of mathematicians and physicists actually have a particular penchant for music. I'll tell you in a minute. The language of the left brain is writing. And you don't need to rekindle that, because that's what society makes sure you can have. Now, I told you about drama as a good way to foster empathy. Probably the best that you can achieve in order to be empathetic is to get sick. That was the model of William Hurt, the doctor. The next path is to act somebody who's sick. Now, interestingly enough, all these languages of the right brain are much older than writing. Music and painting are 40,000 years old. These are cave paintings from Spain, and the oldest bone flute, both are 40,000 years old. The oldest writing is 8,000 years old. Interestingly enough, when we sent our interstellar message in the bottle, which is the Voyager record, this thing is out of the solar system now. Remember, this is Carl Sagan brainchild. What we put on it was no writing. We put in music and imagery. As far as music, we put in Beethoven and Jack Berry, and then, of course, we put imagery, no writing. What is even more interesting is that the very first winter of World War I saw a spontaneous truce in the trenches. The Germans were singing in their trenches Thriller Nacht, and the Brits replied by singing Silent Night. Then they crossed into no man's land, and they exchanged gifts, and they played soccer. A soldier wrote back home, few of us understood a word, but we didn't need to. So again, left brain language had divided them, right brain music have united them, which brings us to the Babel Tower. Okay, so part of the reason I think why the European Union is in trouble is, you know how many languages those guys speak? 23. And with Croatia joining in a year, 24. And that's the Babel Tower. They can't communicate. Now, Spielberg intuited that when, of course, he did the first communication with a foreign civilization. It was music that made us communicate, okay? Compared with music, all communication by word is shameless. Words dilute and brutalize. Words depersonalize. Words make the uncommon common. Life, said Einstein, without playing music is inconceivable for me. I live my daydreams in music. I see my life in music. I get most joy in life out of music. And Heisenberg agreed. He was a gifted classical pianist. Both of them used music whenever they got stuck in their theories. And why? Well, if you look at the brain of musicians, these are not people that listen to music on their iPhone. These are people that make music. Their corpus callosum is larger, richer, and thicker. That means a lot of intercortical trafficking. And indeed, there is tremendous neuroplasticity that takes place when you play a musical instrument. Okay? Don't play what's there, play what's not there. So creativity becomes an important issue. And as I told you, the wife of Einstein made it very clear that whenever he got stuck, he used music to get himself unstuck. Music helps him when he's thinking about his theories. He goes to his study, comes back, strikes a few chords on the piano, jots something down, returns to his study. A few weeks ago, I had dinner with a friend who's a physicist at Penn, and he told me that he plays the flute, and he takes it to work. And he says 80% of people in our division, in our department, play musical instruments, they take it to work. The guy who actually helped Rita Levi-Montalcini create and identify and isolate the nerve growth factor did exactly that. He was a biochemist and he brought his flute to work. All of these were musicians and physicians, from Bill Roth to Schweitzer. And Germany used to encourage the playing of musical instruments as a prerequisite to get into medical school, till the 70s. And when the practice was abandoned, they lamented its demise in an editorial. Now, music sometimes is also used by people to symbolize their disease. For example, Gustav Mahler, as you probably know, because last year was the 100th anniversary of his death, 2 years ago as a matter of fact, died of endocarditis. He had rheumatic fever. And he had, indeed, some sort of diastolic murmur because he was so obsessed by it that he asked his wife, Alma, to listen to it on the second sound. She always said, I heard this rumble. And he put it in his Ninth Symphony. The opening of the Ninth Symphony of Mahler uses the cello and the horns to indicate the first and the second sound, and then the diastolic murmur. Dun, dun, dun. And here it is. And then he gives himself a heart attack, which made his wife, who was 20 years younger, not particularly happy. And of course, she cheated on him. But this was the intuition of Leonard Bernstein that indeed he incorporated in his piece. One of the guys that I'm sure incorporated his disease in his music was Rossini. I love Rossini. Rossini has been described as the best antidepressant. When you feel down, listen to Rossini. But Rossini had most likely a bad case of ADD. And he made sure to tell us in music how the brain of an ADDer feels like. And here it is. They're all singing at the same time, and here's what they're saying, which is very much what the ADDer head feels like. I have a bell in my head that goes din-din. Like the roar of a gun, my head goes boom-boom. Like a crow being plucked, I go crack-crack. I have a hammer in my head that goes tuck-tuck. My whole brain is upside down, can't make any sense, like a ship through waves and rocks. I feel like drowning. And he put something like that in The Barber, he put something like that in Cinderella, and he put something like that in The Italian and Jerry. So he definitely had it. Remember, this guy retires at 31 and doesn't do anything afterwards. All right, so enough said for music. Now let's move on to the next nonverbal form of communication. Drawing, sketching, painting. Now, most good ideas were born as drawing insights from the moon's of Jupiter by Galileo to the plans for a new federal city, which was to become Washington, drawn by Thomas Jefferson, to, of course, the phonograph drawn by Thomas Edison. But even anatomy was reinvented by the artists. It was the work of Leonardo and Michelangelo that really gave us back anatomy. Now, both of them were planning to write a textbook, but were beaten to the punchline by Vesalius, who was able to rely on a Titian student, a fellow Flemish artist called Jan van Kalkar. So we got anatomy from the artists. Now, I was telling you about the fact that seeing things visually is very important for imagination, intuition, creation. And it's very interesting, there are some folks that learn to speak very late in life. So they use this imaginative visual modality much longer. And a good example is Albert Einstein. Einstein spoke for the first time when he was 4 and never fluently till he was 9. So they gave him plenty of time to get his right brain rooted before the left could stifle it. And he always related to the world in visual terms. In fact, if you remember, he identified the secret of relativity by imagining himself as a light beam. So again, this visual approach is important. So can we relearn how to draw? And I'm saying relearn because we all crayoned away till schooling at age 6 killed it. Okay? So can you relearn it? Betty Edwards has spent a lifetime proving that you can. And in fact, she does a course, and at the beginning, she asks you to do a self-portrait, and at the end, she shows to you that you get better. Now, you're not going to be the next Michelangelo, but you can definitely become better and express yourself through imagery. Now, what is good is out of that, you get the benefits of people that can observe with a better eye. Now, Frederick Frank, who worked with Schweitzer, was a physician. He says, if there is something I've learned, is that what I have not drawn, I've never really seen. And of course, we know that we need to be good observers. Conan Doyle, who was himself a physician, had Sherlock Holmes tell Watson, the surgeon, the problem with you, Watson, is that you see, but you do not observe. And Osler put it bluntly, there is no more difficult art to acquire than the art of observation. And then he says the whole art of medicine is observation. So again, if you learn how to sketch, to draw, you'll see better. You can observe a lot by watching, say Yogi Berra. So this idea that the Sherlockian approach to medicine, besides being fun, is also going to be very productive for the outcome is out there and has been the subject of editorials. At Harvard, they take med students to art museums to make them observe works of art. They found that the detection of physical findings improves by 50%. Now, so I enrolled myself in a drawing class. I hadn't done it since I was in college. And I had never used charcoal, and on the 4th session, they gave us a deer skull, and I did that. And I was quite impressed. And then the guy says, well, I'm not going to give you an assignment, because the assignment is to draw a skull. You don't have a skull. I said, I do have a skull. I said, you have a skull? Yeah, I'm a physician. I said, you're a physician? You don't look like one. I said, thank you. I tried so hard not to look like one. So eventually I did it, and I was so proud, I sent it to my daughter. And she wrote back, this is not going to be good for your depressive tendencies. Can't you sketch a puppy or some flowers? Want me to send you some flowers? What about dead flowers? Could you sketch those? That'd be good. Now, Charcot, who invented neurology and has 15 eponyms to his credit, sketched all his life. And of course, he trained famous people. This is Babinski holding the woman that is collapsing in hysteric collapse. This is actually Gilles de la Tourette. And a very famous one was a guy from Vienna who went on to become Sigmund Freud. And on the famous couch, he always kept that lithograph of his great mentor. But the point is that he sketched all his life. This is a sketch made by Charcot of a Moroccan man with Parkinson's. He observed one on a trip to Morocco. He was convinced that made him a better observer. Spinoza sketched all his life to the point that recently Berger has written a book titled Bento Sketchbook, because Bento, of course, was the Portuguese nickname for Spinoza. Spinoza was convinced that his thinking was improved by sketching. That when you sketch, when you draw, time changes, time flows different. It's like meditation. Now, if you doodle while you're listening to a talk, there is good data you're turning off your left brain. And you're really listening in a visual fashion. And that is true. So if you really draw and sketch and people want to talk to you, you can't do it. Because you're using a different modality. It's the best way to turn off the left brain. Now, take a look at our friend Nether. This was something that he did before we knew that an emphysematous is not going to have clubbing. But a blue bloater is going to have clubbing. Now, of course, he was a good observer, and he did it. When you ask medical students, shouldn't emphysemators have clubbing? They say, yes, sure. Why? Well, because clubbing means bad gases. No, clubbing, we know, means shunts, which means the megakaryocytes that leave your bone marrow all the time do not get trapped anymore by the lungs. They go to the periphery, they die in the uveal bed, they release platelet-derived growth factor, and that makes a nest of vessels that obliterates the lovely bone angle. He knew it, and we know it now, because this was an article in JAMA, the Rational Clinical Exam. He saw it. Take a look at Dick Cat, magical realist painter from the Netherlands. He lived between the two great wars, and he died a few months after the Germans invaded his country. He had, indeed, acrocyanosis and clubbing as a result of Fallot, the same Fallot that killed him. And he portrayed that in all his 40 self-portraits. Now, Leonardo da Vinci was convinced that imagery is much more powerful than language, and he put it in his sketches. For example, next to this amazing picture of the heart, he wrote, and of course with Leonardo you have to flip it. Leonardo was, left-handed, but he wrote right to left in a mirror fashion. So imagine his brain. But anyway, here's what he writes. How can you describe this heart in words without filling a whole book? The longer you write, the more you will confuse the listener. And you would only end up knowing the parts, never the whole, which is the definition of the left brain. The left brain knows the parts, but never the whole. Knows the trees, never the forest. And then he got even more vocal up there, and here's what he writes. Writer, what kind of words will you fetch to overly describe what drawing can instead perfectly represent? Don't bother with words unless you're speaking to the blind. Don't mess with things that belong to the eyes. Don't try to smuggle them as something belonging to the ears. You will always be overruled by the painter. Let me give you a good example of how, indeed, number one, visual is much more powerful. Number two, artists got there first. Here's the first description by a physician of the condition in 1858. I challenge you to see it. First among the peculiarities by which these patients may be identified is the tooth ensemble of their physiognomy. Pale earthy complexion, thick pitted skin, sunk flattened nose, scars of all features about the angles of the mouth give the countenance so much of peculiarity that the condition may be recognized at first sight. The opinion is usually borne out by you further observing that the subject is short in stature, has large protruding forehead, and a heavy aspect. Can you see it? No. And this is Hutchinson describing for the first time to a meeting of the British Medical Association congenital syphilis. He got there 200 years after Rembrandt. Because if you go to the Met in New York, you find him, Gerard de Larès. Let me tell you about it. This is a Rembrandt's portrait of a genius in the Netherlands. Probably the best mind they had after Rembrandt. This guy was a Renaissance man. But according to the Dutch, he also had a nauseating appearance. Let's review the nauseating appearance. He's got frontal bows of Perrault. He's got short cheeks. He's got a subtle nose. He's got a very small but protruding jaw. And he's got ragadies, these scars that Hutchinson was describing. And he went blind, probably from interstitial keratitis. Remember the Hutchinson triad? So again, the power of image. Drawing is the root of everything, said Van Gogh. I like to verb words. What? Yeah, I take nouns and adjectives and use them as verbs. Remember when access was a thing? Now it's something you do. It got verbed. Verbing weirds language. Maybe we can eventually make language a complete impediment to understanding. Which of course brings us to the Babel Tower, also called the European Union, and its 24 languages. All right, back to him. This guy had a saddle nose. Remember the saddle nose? A saddle nose is very important in medicine because it's a telltale sign that something happened. This woman showed up in my office, and I said, you got a funky nose. She said, yeah, I've been having this strange nose since I got short of breath. But a colleague of yours, a cardiologist, referred me to you because he couldn't find any cardiac reason why I'm short of breath. He did the $1 million workup, found nothing, sent her to me. And I said, you got a funky nose. He hadn't noticed it. So let's review the differential diagnosis for a saddle nose. Number one is the erosion of the cartilaginous part or the bony part, which basically means, yes, syphilis, but that's what's not our case, Wegener's. That was our case. Could be relapsing polychondritis, could be cocaine nowadays. This is a gazillionaire from Scotland who destroyed his nasal bridge by doing lots of cocaine. And then, of course, the most common is still this, the most famous nose of the Renaissance. Federico da Montefeltro had lost the bridge of the nose, as portrayed by Piero della Francesca, to trauma. And trauma, in his case, had completely destroyed the right-sided half of his face. Okay, so trauma. Now, Rembrandt gave us the best description, the earliest description of rosacea on himself. And of course, rosacea comes with Rhinophyma, okay, which is the opposite of a settled nose. This is Ghirlandaio. Ghirlandaio is the guy who trained Michelangelo. So let's talk a little bit about Rhinophyma. There are some very famous people, like J.P. Morgan, for example, who was so concerned about his visual appearance that he went after photographers whenever they tried to snatch pictures, airbrushed all of them except this one, and this was a meeting between him and Congress as a result of an economic debacle that he was blamed upon. But the point is, we had a president recently who had a little bit of a rosacea. And in fact, it was particularly evident when he got upset. Which brings us to the big question, did Pinocchio have rhinophyma? No, Pinocchio had variable rhinomegaly related to his telling lies, and here is another great insight by an artist, a writer, Collodi. At his third lie, his nose grew so long that poor Pinocchio could no longer run around. The fairy looked at him and laughed. Why are you laughing? I'm laughing at the lie you told. How do you know I told a lie? Lies, my dear boy, I quickly discovered because they come in two flavors. They're either lies with short legs or lies with long noses. And yours is clearly of the long nose variety. Which brings us to the Pinocchio effect. So Carlo Collodi had a great intuition because indeed the nose and the penis are the only organs in our body that share the unfortunate property of having vascular erectile tissue, which is not dependent on volition. So if you wake up in the middle of the night with a stuffed nose and a stuffed something else, that's it. Okay, so why is this relevant? Because when you lie, you vasodilate this thing, and your nose gets itchy, may then actually protrude. And that's called the Pinocchio effect. Now, this guy, Alan Hirsch, who runs at Chicago a center on smell and taste research, has actually banked on that, and he reviewed that President Clinton's tapes on the Levinsky affairs, and what he found is that whenever Billy was lying, he was touching his nose. And then he went after the O.J. Simpson trial, he reviewed the tapes, and whenever O.J. was lying, he was touching his nose. Which proves that he that has eyes to see and ears to hear will soon realize that no human being can keep a secret. And that's because if his lips are silent, he still chatters with his fingertips, so that betrayal oozes out of him at every pore. And that's Sigmund. You can observe a lot by watching. All right, now, do we teach med students how to observe faces? Now, 90% of emotional communication is conveyed through the contraction of muscles. They're totally involuntary. Okay? Now, it's fascinating from an evolutionary standpoint that as a species, we dedicate an entire set of muscles to tell our fellow human being whether we're angry. Makes evolutionary sense because, of course, if the guy looks angry, you're going to run away, and you're more likely, if you can read faces, that you maintain your genes. But we don't teach residents how to read faces. We don't teach residents how to read body language. Ekman has made a career on it. He's the guy who trains the people at the airports to read faces so that they can pick up the terrorist. And indeed, there's a lot of science on it. There's a book by Ekman on lying. Most lies succeed because no one goes through the work to figure out how to catch them. 90% of emotional communication is nonverbal, and most of it is expressed through the face, through facial muscles. Drawing, good data, enhances the reading of faces. And again, we don't teach med students how to read faces. Which brings us to him. You're evaluating a 62-year-old Roman emperor. He's a medical school dropout with a long interest in travel, architecture, poetry, and everything Greek, to the point that in Rome they call him the Greekling, and then they giggle. They giggle because he has a Spanish accent. Then he has 3 senators executed, and the giggling stops. In fact, he's competitive, driven, impatient, irascible, but other than that, a nice guy. at the present time is too short of breath to argue with you or have you executed. And you're a physician, you're a Greek physician, you're a good physician, you're a good observer, and you notice that he's got big neck veins, swollen belly, swollen legs, he's short of breath, and he has a history of epistaxis, which means some sort of hypertensive heart failure. But you're fascinated by his ears. See that? He's got an earlobe crease. He's got a Frank sign. Now, Senator Steve Frank wrote a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine in the 70s saying, I have a lot of people in my practice with this crease. They all have heart failure. Has anybody ever reported it? And the New England Journal said, no. Every single bust of Emperor Hadrian has it. And Hadrian died of heart failure. Whether you look at the bust that is in Rome, or is in Naples, or is in Madrid, or is in Athens, or is in Florence, or is even on the coins that were made out of the emperor. So let's talk about the earlobe crease. Earlobe, like your brain and your heart, has terminal circulation. So if you clog this thing, you're going to infarct it. And if you infarct it, you get a crease, which is acquired. This is not something you ever have unless you infarct it. Now, if you have a preauricular crease, even worse. This was a recent paper by the Brazilians. Lots of studies have been done on it since Frank. 60 studies have confirmed that, this is indeed an independent variable. Let me show you this study by Dr. Elliott. 1,000 patients. 74% of those who had the crease had coronary artery disease compared to 16% of those creaseless. And again, 60 studies have confirmed it, and it is an independent variable. Okay? Now, it's all over the place because once you know this stuff, you see it. Take, for example, these three men that together controlled the future of the European Union just a few years ago. The guy on the left self-combusted on his penis. Remember him? The guy on the right is the French fellow that eventually passed the baton of the European Bank to this Italian guy. And so now everything rests on Draghi. Let's take a look at Draghi and his ears. Not good. Then there is this other guy. Remember him? He's got another one. Now, you could argue it's a wrinkle in time. It's part of getting old. Now, Draghi is younger. So in Draghi's case, it may be more relevant. Anyway, I've been looking at a lot of ears. And, of course, I'm fascinated by George. And, yes, George, while in office, got his earlobe crease. Now, so let's take a look at him. Let's magnify the presidential here. He's got a preauricular crease that's even worse, and he's got hair in the canal, which is visually unappealing, but also helpful, because if you got hair in the canal, you have a hypertestosteronic state. And there are 3 papers, 2 from the US and 1 from India, that suggest if you have hair in the canal, even more likely that you're going to have a heart attack. Okay? Now, folks, that's me. That's the year 2006 when the students gave me a portrait as their best teacher. My ear is intact. Not anymore. And I know when I got it. I got it when she ran for office. So if, like me and George, if on an ear there is a crease, do not assume the life will cease. If ear is knotted in the ear, do not assume that death is near. So if when walking down the street, an ear with ear and crease you meet, don't give the gent a dreadful fright. Don't hint infarction is inside. All right, so Hadrian was an architect. He designed the Pantheon. He invented the concept of the dome. So let's enter the Pantheon in Rome, and you find the grave of this very handsome young man. And let's review it. So it's Good Friday, 1520. You are one of the greatest artists of the Italian Renaissance. You're 37 years of age, and you're about to die. You were born on Good Friday, and this is Good Friday, and you're Italian, so you're superstitious. You know you're going to die. And everything is blamed on your mistress. According to Vasari, you just had a long night of lovemaking with her, and that created all the problem. In reality, it's malaria, but that's a different story. So what you do, you call for a friend and you say, I want to take care of her, so when I die, this is money for her, and then you die. And when you die, they go to your studio and they find the last canvas you portrayed of her. And she's Margherita Luti, called La Fornarina, because her father had a bakery. And what you see is that she's naked. The only painting where she's naked. And she's pointing to the breast. Let's review it. The breast is enlarged in the floor. There's a mass. There is a skin discoloration and a little retraction just below it, And there is a satellite node and swelling, which basically means that she had breast cancer. This is the first description of breast cancer by an artist. And indeed, La Fornarina was his mistress, but basically was his common law wife. Upon the death of Raphael, entered a nunnery and never got out alive. I'm coming towards the end. Raphael, of course, painted the School of Athens in the Vatican, and when you go there, you find Plato, who's Leonardo da Vinci, you find Aristotle, you find a self-portrait of Raphael, you find another body portrayed as Hypatia, but most importantly, standing out alone, you find Michelangelo, portrayed as Heraclitus. Why is this relevant? Because when you look at his knee, it's a bad knee. It has these bumps. And it's not a hot knee. Michelangelo was only in his 30s. It's gouty knee. Okay, those are 3 tophi. All right, and there's no doubt that Michelangelo had problems with gout. In fact, he talked about how at the age of 35 he had multiple colics. The colics were due to the fact that he lived on bread and wine. Wine in those years was drunk out of glasses that they contained lead, and also was drunk out of pewter that contained lead. So all of those folks had saturnine gout. And he did write about it. I had to learn how to know the painful urine. Okay? So again, remember, he lived to his 90s, but still he had this kind of problem. Which brings us to the last great artist. And you are familiar with this. Now, if you have read the article in The Lancet, don't say. If you have not, is there anything funny about that cloud around God? Yes, it is a brain. Okay? So there is a Michelangelo code. There is no Da Vinci code, but there is a Michelangelo code. The Michelangelo code has actually been recently published in this book by 2 Brazilian physicians. Michelangelo embedded in the Sistine Chapel all these anatomic little codes, because number one, he couldn't stand the church. Number two, he was trying to really show all the things he had learned. What he had learned is that our thoughts come from the brain, and maybe God is a figment of the brain, or maybe God gave us the brain as his greatest gift. So let's review some of these. And this was in The Lancet. This is the throat of God, the brainstem. This is a little bit far-fetched. Maybe the shoulder. I like this one better, the right heart. This one I like because I'm a pulmonologist. And of course, this is a trachea. Now, this is a little bit far-fetched. These are 2 kidneys. Mostly they come from this, which is the separation of earth and water. And again, the cloud, once again, it's a section of the kidney. And Michelangelo knew a lot about kidneys. Okay? All right, so wrapping it up. You need to be a good observer. It will serve you in medicine. Take a look at this kid. Do you see anything unusual about this kid? He's tall and lanky, but he's something very unique and abnormal. And Leonardo gave us the proportions in Vitruvian Man, would have immediately picked up that this is too long. From the symphysis to the ground should be the same as from the symphysis to the crown. But this kid is too much. There are 1 out of 10,000 of them that have been walking around us on the planet, but it took 1896 years after Jesus Christ for Marfan to realize that they were funny. So, folks, the point of all this is that there are lots of diseases out there waiting for a name. So, if we got a Flexner report, we need an Osler report. We need to put back some of this stuff. And again, I'm not talking about humanities. I'm talking about a different way of thinking, a different way of engaging the world, so that we can become, again, a symphony of hemispheres. And then there is this other aspect. All good. A true or false test. At last, some clarity. Every sentence is either pure, sweet truth or a vile, contemptible lie. One or the other, nothing in between. Yes, tolerance for ambiguity is important in medicine. When I was young, said Ennio Flaiano, wrote all the scripts for Fellini, I thought that the opposite of a truth was a lie, and the opposite of a lie was a truth. Now that I'm older, I'm starting to suspect that the opposite of a truth may be another truth, and the opposite of a lie, another lie. Now, Osler, before leaving, said, no human being is constituted to know the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Even the best of men must be content with fragments, glimpses, never the full fruition. And I told you about how she actually went out on a limb. Said medical schools need to admit students with high tolerance for ambiguity. We'll get more primary care, we'll get less tests, we'll get more happiness. And indeed, they're changing admission criteria. She's convinced that the more intolerant you are, the more intolerant you become, and vice versa. She has no data to back that up. So my last slide is actually back to Rembrandt. Rembrandt was a symphony of hemispheres, and Rembrandt portrayed himself 90 times. And if you want to know about the human condition, morph them all in a 2-minute video, and that's what I'm going to show you, from the time he was a kid till he died, and he saw it all. He saw himself rise to great richness and go bankrupt. He lost his wife, he lost his mistress, he lost all his children. And here he is. Thank you so much.